My name's Jack Riley, and for the past 3 years, I've been the night guard at Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. It's not the kind of job you grow up dreaming about, but it pays the bills, and I don't mind being alone. Honestly, I've always preferred the quiet. You'd think a place like Bonaventure, famous for its moss-draped oaks and historic graves, would lose its charm when the sun sets. It doesn't. If anything, it becomes something else entirely. Less serene, more watchful. I know how that sounds, but I'm not the only one who's felt it. Even the day staff joke about the watchers. At night, though, it doesn't feel like a joke. It started as a normal evening. I clocked in at 10 o'clock p.m., grabbed my flashlight, and made my rounds. The graveyard sprawls for acres, and the only light comes from the moon and the faint orange glow of the street lamps along the outer road. I checked the gates, passed by the crumbling tombs in the older section, and made a mental note to report the overturned trash can near the chapel. Routine stuff. But as I walked toward the farthest edge of the property, where the trees grow thicker and the air always feels heavier, something stopped me in my tracks. It was a sound, soft, almost like whispering, but distant. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees. Still, my pulse quickened. I shook it off and kept walking, but the feeling stayed with me. You know that prickling sensation, like someone's watching you? I couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. At least, no one I could see. When I finished my rounds, I headed back to the small security office near the entrance. It's nothing fancy, just a desk, a chair, and a set of monitors hooked up to outdated security cameras. I flipped through the feeds, scanning for anything out of place. The cameras don't cover the entire cemetery, but they're enough to catch any trespassers. At least, they usually are. That night, one of the cameras started glitching. The feed from the east gate, near the oldest graves, kept flickering. Static, then darkness, then back again. I tapped the monitor, muttering under my breath. It wasn't unusual for the equipment to act up, but something about the timing made me uneasy. The whispering, the shadows. It was too much to ignore. I decided to check it out. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, and the Spanish moss hanging from the trees swayed like tattered curtains. I could still hear the faint hum of the city in the distance, but out here, it felt like a world apart. As I approached the east gate, the unease turned into something heavier. The air felt thick, almost electric, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, nothing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of headstones and the twisting branches above. I reached the gate and scanned the area, but everything looked normal. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance among the graves. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. At least, I think they were staring. It was too dark to see their face. My throat tightened, and I gripped the flashlight harder. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I took a step forward, then another. The figure didn't move. I was about to call out again when the flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me as I smacked it, trying to get the beam back. When it finally flickered on, the figure was gone. I stood there frozen, gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath came out in shallow puffs, and the silence around me felt suffocating. Whoever, or whatever, that figure was, they couldn't have just disappeared. There wasn't anywhere to hide, no trees or large monuments nearby, just flat rows of graves. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it over the headstones. "If someone's out here, you need to leave," I called out, trying to sound firm, but my voice wavered. No response. Just that oppressive silence, heavier now, like it was pressing down on me. I stayed out there for another minute, maybe two, before the unease got the better of me. My job was to keep out trespassers, sure, but something about this didn't feel like your average thrill-seeker looking for a scare. I turned back toward the security office, walking faster than I should have, trying not to let my imagination run wild. When I finally made it back to the office, I locked the door behind me, double-checking it like a paranoid fool. My heart was still racing, and my mind kept replaying what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. I sat down at the desk and rewound the camera feed for the east gate, hoping to get another look at the figure. But the footage was useless. The camera had cut out entirely for those few minutes, just static. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the edges of the desk. That didn't make sense. Even when the cameras glitched, they didn't go completely dark for that long. It was like someone, or something, had deliberately killed the feed. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to shake it off and focus on something else. There were still a couple of hours left on my shift, and I wasn't about to spend them jumping at shadows. I pulled out the logbook and started jotting down notes about the night. The flickering camera, the overturned trash can, the figure. Writing it down made it feel more real, like I wasn't just imagining things. But as I wrote, I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that I'd made a mistake by coming back inside, like I'd turned my back on something I shouldn't have. The rest of the shift passed slowly, too slowly. Every little sound, the creak of the old wooden chair, the hum of the monitors, made me flinch. By the time my relief showed up at 6:00 a.m., I was practically counting down the seconds. I didn't tell him about the figure. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen someone vanish into thin air? He'd think I'd lost it. I drove home, but even after a hot shower and a stiff drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I told myself it was just a fluke, that I was tired and my imagination had gotten the better of me. But deep down, I knew better. The next night, I returned to the cemetery, hoping for a quiet shift to put my nerves at ease. For the first few hours, that's exactly what I got. No flickering cameras, no strange sounds, just the usual stillness of the graveyard. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, that same heavy feeling crept back in. It started with the camera in the old chapel. The feed went fuzzy, then cut out entirely. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, my stomach twisting into knots. As I approached the chapel, I noticed something strange. The door, which was always locked, was slightly ajar. I hesitated. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I pushed the door open slowly, the old hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the chapel was dark, the faint smell of mildew and damp stone hanging in the air. My flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on rows of wooden pews and the small altar at the front. And then I saw it. something carved into the floor near the altar. A symbol I didn't recognize, scratched deep into the stone. I stood in the doorway of the chapel, staring at the strange symbol carved into the stone floor near the altar. It was about the size of a dinner plate, a jagged, looping design that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. It wasn't something a bored teenager could have scratched into the stone with a pocket knife. This was deliberate, deep, and unsettling. I hesitated before stepping inside. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. My flashlight beam trembled as I crossed the threshold. The air inside felt wrong, too heavy, too still. My boots echoed on the cold floor as I approached the altar, and the symbol came into sharper focus. The edges of the carving were unnaturally smooth, almost polished, and it glistened faintly under the light, like it had been rubbed with something. I crouched down for a closer look, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't just carved. It looked fresh. The stone dust around the edges hadn't even settled. I reached out to touch it but stopped myself an inch away. My fingertips tingled, like the air around the carving was charged. Then I heard it again, that whispering. It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was inside the chapel, faint and barely audible, like the voice of someone trying not to be heard. My stomach flipped as I stood up, my flashlight darting around the room. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing back at me. The whispering stopped. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Just the pounding of my heart and the faint creak of the wooden beams above. I should have left right then, but instead, I stepped closer to the altar, trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation for all of this. Maybe a homeless person had snuck in. Maybe the wind. Then the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty chapel, and I whipped around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The door stood closed, the heavy iron latch firmly in place. I ran over and pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the latch had locked itself from the outside. "All right, very funny," I shouted, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Whoever's out there, open the door." My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated how small I sounded. The only response was silence. I turned back toward the altar, my back pressed against the door. The symbol seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, though I knew that had to be my imagination. The air felt colder now, and my breath came out in visible puffs. That whispering started again, louder this time, but still impossible to pin down. It wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere. "Stop it!" I yelled, my voice bouncing off the stone walls. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to swirl around me. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, the chapel was completely still. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. I let out a shaky breath and tried the door again. This time, it opened easily, the hinges creaking as if nothing had happened. I stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop moving until I was back at the security office, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my flashlight twice trying to set it on the desk. I sank into the chair, staring blankly at the monitors, trying to process what had just happened. But then something on the screen caught my eye. The feed from the chapel was back online, the camera panning slowly across the room. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The symbol was gone. The floor was smooth and unmarked, as though it had never been there. But just before the camera turned away, I saw movement. A shadow, slipping out of view near the altar. I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chapel, the carved symbol, and that fleeting shadow on the monitor. By the time my shift came around again, I was running on fumes and more nervous than I'd ever been about going back to work. When I arrived, I told myself I'd keep my rounds to the main areas of the cemetery and steer clear of the chapel. Whatever had happened there last night, whether it was a prank, my imagination, or something worse, I wasn't eager to relive it. For the first hour, everything was quiet. I stayed near the security office, watching the monitors and keeping my flashlight close. But around 11:30, the camera for the east gate, the one that had glitched the night before, started acting up again. Static, then darkness, then back to static. My stomach sank. I didn't want to go out there, but ignoring it wasn't an option. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and locked the office door behind me. The air was colder than usual for Savannah, and the wind carried a faint metallic tang that made me uneasy. The walk to the east gate felt longer than usual. The shadows between the graves seemed darker, and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path was the only noise. When I reached the gate, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The camera was mounted on a pole nearby, its lens staring blankly into the dark. I shone my flashlight on it, half expecting to see it damaged or tampered with, but it looked fine. As I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight in a wide arc. That's when I saw the figure again. They were farther away this time, standing near the edge of the older section of the cemetery, where the graves were weathered and crumbling. My heart pounded as I raised my flashlight higher, trying to get a better look. The beam caught on their shape. A person, tall and still, with something unnatural about the way they held themselves. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were studying me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing in the cold air. No response. I started walking toward them, trying to keep my fear in check. "This is private property. You're trespassing." I took maybe 3 steps before they moved, not toward me, away, gliding through the graves without a sound. It wasn't running. It was like they were floating just above the ground. My mouth went dry as I picked up my pace, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to follow them. But the faster I walked, the farther away they seemed. It didn't make sense. The cemetery wasn't that big, and there were no trees or obstructions in that area where someone could hide. Yet within seconds, the figure had vanished into the dark. I stopped, panting, and turned in a slow circle. My flashlight beam swept over rows of headstones, bare tree branches, and empty space. No sign of them. I wanted to believe they'd just been playing games, but deep down, I knew better. No human moved like that. When I finally made it back to the security office, I was done. My shift wasn't even halfway over, but I didn't care. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat at the desk with my back to the wall, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. And then the monitor for the east gate flickered back to life. The screen showed the same patch of ground I'd just been standing on. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then, slowly, the figure stepped into view. They stopped in the exact spot where I'd been minutes earlier, their head tilted in that same unnatural way. This time, I could feel them looking directly at the camera. At me. And then they smiled. That smile. I'll never forget it. It wasn't a grin or a smirk. It was something else entirely, stretched too wide, like the muscles in their face didn't work the way they should. It didn't look human. It was the kind of expression that didn't belong in the real world, let alone on the monitor in front of me. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio on the desk. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? There's a smiling shadow person in the cemetery? They'd laugh me off the phone. And besides, part of me didn't want to take my eyes off the screen. I felt like if I looked away, I'd miss something. Or worse, they'd move. But they didn't move. They just stood there, staring directly at the camera. The smile never wavered. I don't know how long I sat there, staring back, but eventually the screen flickered again. Static replaced the image, and the camera feed went dark. I leaned back in the chair, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My palms were sweaty, and I realized I'd been gripping the edge of the desk so hard that my fingers ached. I told myself it was just another glitch, that the figure wasn't real, but the memory of that smile wouldn't let me believe it. I didn't leave the office for the rest of the night. Every time I thought about stepping outside, I imagined that figure waiting for me, standing just beyond the light. Instead, I stayed glued to the monitors, watching the other feeds like a hawk. But nothing else happened. The remaining hours dragged by in tense silence until my relief finally showed up at 6 o'clock a.m. As soon as I got home, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept replaying the night over and over, dissecting every detail. The whispering in the chapel, the symbol on the floor, the figure at the east gate, and that smile. I told myself I wasn't going back, that I'd call in sick and start looking for a new job. But when the time came, I found myself heading back to Bonaventure anyway. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just stubbornness, but I couldn't walk away without understanding what was happening. That night, I arrived earlier than usual, just as the day staff were leaving. I lingered near the gate, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees. As much as I hated the night shift, the idea of being here after dark felt different now. It wasn't just unsettling, it felt dangerous. I started my rounds as usual, flashlight in hand, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. For the first hour or two, everything seemed normal. The cameras worked fine, the graves were undisturbed, and the whispering was blessedly absent. But then, as I approached the older section of the cemetery, I noticed something strange. One of the headstones had been moved. It was a small, weathered marker, the name and dates too faded to read. I knew it didn't belong where it was. I'd walked this section hundreds of times, and that stone had always been farther up the hill. Now it was lying flat on the ground, surrounded by disturbed dirt, as if someone had dragged it there. I crouched down to get a better look, my flashlight casting long shadows across the uneven ground. That's when I saw the scratches. Deep grooves in the stone, like claw marks running from the top to the bottom. They weren't natural. They weren't from weather or erosion. Someone, or something, had done this recently. A sound behind me made me jump. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path. I stood up quickly, spinning around with my flashlight, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, the beam of light shaking in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the still night. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt alive, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A shadow moving between the graves, too fast and too large to be human. It disappeared behind a mausoleum, and I took a step back, my legs trembling. The shadow didn't reappear, but the unease in my gut told me it wasn't gone. It was waiting. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trained on the mausoleum. When I reached the main path, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of the security office. But as I locked the door and sank into my chair, I realized something chilling. The shadow hadn't just moved between the graves. It had moved toward me. I didn't sleep again. The moment I got home, I locked every door and window, something I hadn't done in years. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the shadows of my apartment. By the time my next shift rolled around, my nerves were shot. I drove to Bonaventure Cemetery with my jaw clenched, every muscle in my body on edge. The memory of the shadow moving toward me wouldn't leave my mind. It wasn't a trick of the light, I was sure of that. Whatever it was, it knew I'd seen it. I told myself I'd get through the night by staying in the security office, glued to the cameras. No more wandering into dark corners or chasing figures. But as soon as I clocked in, something felt off. The air in the office was stifling, like it hadn't been opened in weeks, and the monitors seemed dimmer than usual, their glow casting weak shadows on the walls. I flipped through the feeds. For a while, everything looked normal. Rows of graves, swaying tree branches, the occasional gust of wind kicking up dry leaves. But as I reached the camera covering the main pathway, I froze. The figure was back. They stood in the center of the path, their body angled slightly away from the camera. This time, I could make out more details. Their clothes looked tattered, loose-fitting, and out of place for the modern world. Their head was tilted to the side, that unnatural posture I'd seen before. And they were still. Completely, terrifyingly still. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have gotten that deep into the cemetery without me noticing. I hadn't even heard the gate creak open. Before I could react, the figure turned. Slowly, deliberately. Their face came into full view, and my stomach dropped. The smile was back, wider this time, stretching inhumanly across their face. Their eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. I sat frozen, unable to look away, as they raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera. At me. I shoved back from the desk so hard my chair tipped over, sending me sprawling onto the floor. My flashlight rolled out of my hand, clattering against the wall. When I scrambled back up to look at the monitor again, the figure was gone. The pathway was empty, just swaying trees and rows of headstones. But I knew what I'd seen. This wasn't some glitch or hallucination. My hands shook as I grabbed the radio. I needed to call for help, to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But before I could, there was a knock at the door. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. I froze, staring at the door like it might come alive. No one should have been out there. The cemetery was locked, and the day staff had gone home hours ago. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight, its weight suddenly feeling too light, too useless. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, just silence. The knock came again, this time slower, harder, like whoever, or whatever, it was, wanted to make sure I heard. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back from the door. I didn't want to open it, but the thought of not knowing what was on the other side was almost worse. I crept toward the door, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The small window at the top of the door was fogged over from the humidity, but I could see a faint outline, a shadowy figure standing motionless on the other side. "Leave now!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't move. The knock came a third time, so hard it rattled the door in its frame. My knees nearly buckled as I stepped back, my flashlight pointed at the door like it was a weapon. I opened my mouth to yell again, but before I could, the doorknob started to turn. Slowly, I backed up until I hit the desk, my flashlight beam glued to the door. The knob twisted all the way, and the door creaked open an inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. I stared at the gap, expecting the figure to push their way in, but instead, the door opened just wide enough for me to hear a voice. It was low, gravelly, and impossibly close. The words made my blood run cold. "You're not supposed to be here." That voice. I'll never forget the way it sounded, like it came from deep underground, layered with something raw and ancient. It was quiet, but carried a weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. The words echoed in my head, looping over and over. "You're not supposed to be here." The door remained open just a crack, the darkness beyond it yawning like a void. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam barely penetrating the blackness. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing did. No shadow, no figure, just silence. I finally snapped out of it, slamming the door shut with a force that made the whole frame shake. My hands fumbled with the lock, and when it clicked into place, I stumbled back, gasping for air. The office felt suffocating, the walls closing in as my thoughts raced. What had I just heard? Who, or what, had spoken to me? I checked the monitors again, desperate for some explanation, but the feeds were empty. The pathway where the figure had stood was deserted. The cemetery looked peaceful, almost serene, but I knew better. The unease in my gut told me I wasn't alone, not anymore. The voice stayed with me, replaying in my mind as I paced the office. "You're not supposed to be here." What did it mean? Was it a warning? A threat? Part of me wanted to leave, to get in my car and never come back. But another part, the same part that had kept me coming back night after night, wouldn't let me. I needed to know what was happening. I needed answers. Eventually, I made a decision. I couldn't hide in the office all night. If I was going to confront whatever was out there, I had to do it on my terms. Grabbing my flashlight and a heavy metal baton we kept for self-defense, I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it cleared my head enough to focus. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. I stayed on the main path, my flashlight sweeping over the graves and trees. Every crunch of gravel under my boots sounded deafening, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again. As I walked, I found myself drawn toward the older section of the cemetery, the part where the shadow had moved toward me the night before. I didn't want to go there, but something pulled me in that direction, like an invisible thread tugging at my chest. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the uneasy feeling in my stomach turned into full-blown dread. When I reached the area, I stopped in my tracks. The headstone that had been moved was back in its original place, upright and undisturbed. But the scratches, the deep, jagged claw marks I'd seen, were gone. The stone looked smooth and untouched, like nothing had ever happened. I crouched down, running my fingers over the surface. It didn't make sense. The damage had been real. I'd seen it, felt it. Now it was as if the cemetery itself had erased it. That's when I heard the whispering again. It started softly, like the wind rustling through the trees, but it grew louder with every passing second. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me, surrounding me. The voices overlapped, dozens of them, maybe more, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded as I spun in circles, shining my flashlight in every direction. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short gasps. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. That's when I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't moving between the graves this time. It was standing still, just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. The shape was human, but wrong. Its edges were blurry, like smoke trapped in the form of a person. It didn't glide or float. It just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. My flashlight trembled as I raised it higher, trying to get a better look. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. But then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed. Not at me, behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark. There was nothing there, just more graves and swaying tree branches. But when I turned back, the shadow was gone. In its place was something else. The ground where it had stood was disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. And in the middle of the loose soil was an object, a small black key that gleamed under the moonlight. I didn't want to touch the key. Everything about it screamed that I shouldn't. But there it was, half buried in the freshly disturbed dirt, gleaming unnaturally under the moonlight. It looked old, its surface smooth and polished, yet it had an unnatural luster, almost like it was calling to me. My hands shook as I crouched down, shining my flashlight over the key. The air around me felt heavy again. that same suffocating weight I'd felt in the chapel. For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving it there and forgetting the whole thing. But I couldn't. Something deep in my gut told me that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop unless I faced it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and picked up the key. It was cold. Not the kind of cold you'd expect from metal left outside on a chilly night. It was deeper, biting, like it had been pulled from ice. The moment it was in my hand, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through my palm, and I nearly dropped it. But I held on. As soon as I had the key, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The voices surrounded me, overlapping and chaotic, like dozens of people were speaking at once. The language was still incomprehensible, but one word kept standing out, repeated over and over. Open. I staggered back, clutching the key so hard it dug into my skin. My flashlight swung wildly as I scanned the area, but there was no one there. Just shadows and graves. The whispering didn't stop. It only grew louder, filling my ears, my head, until I felt like I was going to lose it. "Shut up!" I screamed, my voice cracking in the stillness. And just like that, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that made my ears ring. I stood there, trembling, the key clutched tightly in my hand. It felt heavier now, like it was anchoring me to the ground. I shoved it into my pocket and stumbled back toward the security office, my legs barely holding me up. When I finally made it inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. The office felt just as oppressive as the outside, the air thick and stale. My flashlight's beam wavered as I set it on the desk and sank into the chair. I pulled the key out of my pocket, holding it up to the weak light from the monitors. It wasn't just old. It was ancient. Its surface was smooth, but faint markings ran along its length, symbols that didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. They seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light, almost like they were alive. I turned it over in my hand, my pulse racing. What door could this key possibly open? And why had it been left for me? I didn't have time to dwell on it, because the monitors flickered again. This time, the static didn't stay confined to one camera. Every feed cut out, one after the other, until the screens were filled with nothing but snow. The room plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the static. My heart pounded as I stared at the monitors, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. One by one, the cameras flickered back on. But the images weren't what they should have been. The paths, the graves, the trees, they were all wrong. The cemetery looked warped. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching unnaturally toward the sky. The headstones were crooked, some split down the middle as if struck by lightning. The ground was uneven, and deep fissures ran through the earth. And then, in the center of the East Gate camera, I saw it. The figure. This time, it was closer. Much closer. It stood just outside the gate, its head tilted in that familiar, unnatural way. But there was something different now. Its form wasn't just shadowy. It was clearer, more defined. I could see the outline of its face, the way its lips stretched into that awful, impossibly wide smile. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare straight through the camera, through the screen, and directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure raised a hand, pointing again. But this time, it didn't point toward the graves or the chapel. It pointed toward the security office. Toward me. A loud knock shattered the silence, and I nearly fell out of my chair. It came from the office door. 3 hard, deliberate knocks, just like the night before. My stomach twisted as I realized the cameras weren't showing static anymore. They were showing me. Every single feed was focused on the security office, on the door, on me sitting inside. The knocking came again, harder this time, shaking the door in its frame. My pulse roared in my ears as I stood, clutching the key like it was my only lifeline. The third knock came, louder than before, and then everything went silent. And then the doorknob started to turn. The doorknob turned slowly, the metal rattling softly in the silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop. I backed away from the door, gripping the black key so tightly that the edges bit into my palm. I didn't know what I was expecting to see on the other side, but I knew I didn't want to find out. "Stay out!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The words echoed uselessly in the small room. The doorknob stopped turning for a moment, and I held my breath, praying that whatever was out there would leave. But it didn't. With an audible click, the lock disengaged, and the door creaked open an inch. Cold air seeped in, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang I'd noticed before. My flashlight sat useless on the desk, and the weak glow of the monitors barely illuminated the room. I couldn't see beyond the crack in the door, just a sliver of darkness that felt impossibly deep. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only silence. The door creaked open farther, inch by inch, until it was fully ajar. The hallway outside was empty, bathed in shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. My stomach twisted as I realized something was wrong. There was no wind, no reason for the door to open on its own. And yet, there it was, wide open, as if inviting me to step outside. I stayed where I was, rooted to the spot. My eyes darted to the monitors, but the cameras were still focused on the security office, showing me standing there, staring at the open door. It was surreal, like watching myself in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, echoing down the gravel path outside. They weren't coming toward me. They were circling the office. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the window, half expecting to see a shadow pass by. But the glass showed nothing but the dark outlines of the graves and trees beyond. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I gripped the key tighter, my mind racing. I could feel its unnatural cold seeping into my skin, but I didn't let go. The key had to mean something. It had to be connected to all of this. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The air felt heavier with every step, like I was wading through water. When I reached the door, I stopped, my hand hovering over the frame. The darkness outside seemed alive, pulsing faintly like it was breathing. I swallowed hard and stepped into the doorway, my flashlight clutched tightly in my other hand. The gravel path stretched out in both directions, empty. The rows of graves stood silent, the moss-draped trees swaying gently in the breeze. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. "Show yourself," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was talking to the figure, the shadow, or whatever had been knocking on the door. The only response was the faint rustle of leaves overhead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned sharply, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the path, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. This time, I could see them clearly. Their face was pale, almost translucent, and the smile stretched impossibly wide, the edges curling upward like something out of a nightmare. Their eyes were empty voids, black and endless, and they were staring directly at me. The figure didn't move, but I felt their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, my body frozen as the figure raised a hand and pointed. Not at me this time, at the key in my hand. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure tilted their head, that eerie smile never wavering. The wind picked up, carrying the faint whisper of a single word. "Open." The key in my hand grew colder, the symbols on its surface seeming to shift under my fingers. I didn't know what it was meant to open, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't lead to anything good. The figure stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were testing the air around them. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the figure vanished. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, leaving nothing but the faint sound of whispering in their wake. But the key, it was heavier now, its coldness more intense. I looked down at it, my hand trembling, and saw something that hadn't been there before. One of the symbols had changed, its lines sharper and more defined, almost glowing faintly in the dark. The key was ready. For what? I didn't know. But I had the sinking feeling I was about to find out. The key felt like it was burning in my hand now, even though its surface was cold as ice. The symbol that had changed glowed faintly, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. I knew, deep down, that whatever this key was meant to open, I couldn't avoid it anymore. The figure, the shadow, the whispers, they weren't going to stop until I did what they wanted. I stood on the gravel path, staring into the dark cemetery, waiting for some sign of where to go. The air was still, the silence suffocating. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the blackness. Then I heard it, a sound that sent chills down my spine. A door creaking open. The sound came from deep within the cemetery, in the direction of the old chapel. My stomach sank. I didn't want to go back there, but the pull of the key was undeniable now, like an invisible force was dragging me forward. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the path toward the sound. As I approached the chapel, the air grew colder, heavier. The faint smell of mildew and damp stone hung in the air, and the whispering started again, soft at first, but growing louder with each step. The chapel door, which had been firmly shut the last time I'd seen it, now stood wide open. Beyond it, The interior was cloaked in darkness, the faint outline of the altar barely visible in the gloom. I hesitated on the threshold, gripping the key tightly. "This is insane," I muttered to myself. But I knew I couldn't turn back. Something had brought me here, and whatever it wasn't going to let me go until I finished this. Stepping inside, I felt the temperature drop even further. The whispers surrounded me now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered again, its beam illuminating the stone floor, and the symbol I'd seen before, carved into the ground near the altar. Only now, it was glowing faintly, its jagged lines pulsing with the same eerie light as the key in my hand. I approached the symbol cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to stop. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but I could hear one word repeated over and over, clear as day. "Open, open, open." The key in my hand felt impossibly heavy now, its glow syncing perfectly with the pulsing light of the symbol. My breath came in shallow gasps as I knelt down and placed the key in the center of the carving. The moment it touched the stone, the whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the ground beneath me began to tremble. The glowing lines of the symbol spread outward, snaking across the floor like cracks in glass. The chapel walls groaned, the air vibrating with an energy I couldn't describe. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the floor split open, revealing a black void beneath. From the darkness came a sound, a deep, guttural roar that shook me to my core. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something far older, far more terrifying. The kind of sound that made your body instinctively want to run, even though you knew there was no escaping it. A hand. No, not a hand. A claw emerged from the void, its long bony fingers gripping the edge of the cracked floor. Then another. The figure that rose from the darkness wasn't the shadowy form I'd seen before. This was something else entirely. Its body was impossibly tall, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to absorb the light. Its face was featureless except for a wide, jagged mouth that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. And it was smiling. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me as the creature fully emerged. It towered over me, its presence filling the chapel with an oppressive weight. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare as it turned its hollow, empty gaze toward me. "You've done well," it said, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "The door is open." The key in my hand disintegrated into ash, falling through my fingers as the creature stepped closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was its smile, impossibly wide and filled with sharp, glistening teeth. And then there was nothing.